The town library was a sanctuary for many, including me. I always found comfort amidst its tall wooden shelves and the scent of old pages. That day, as the sun streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow on everything, I was engrossed in the romance section, trying to find a book that I hadn't read. A soft thud and the flutter of pages startled me, and I looked up to find myself almost nose to nose with a man who appeared just as surprised. He had hazel eyes that sparkled with amusement and a slightly disheveled tuft of brown hair. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I stammered, realizing I'd knocked a few books out of his hands. "I should have been more careful." He chuckled. "No harm done. I'm David." He extended a hand to help pick up the scattered books. "Amelia," I replied, grateful for the friendly gesture. As we collected the books, our fingers brushed against each other, causing a tiny jolt of electricity. I glanced up to see if he felt it too. From the faint blush on his cheeks, it seemed he did. "So, Amelia," David began, breaking the momentary silence, "are you always this engrossed in your book choices?" I laughed. "Only when I can't decide on my next fictional escape. How about you? What brings you to the library?" "I've been trying to find a good book on photography," he admitted, pointing to the stack in his hands. "It's more than just a hobby for me." Our conversation turned to hobbies, dreams, and even our favorite foods. It was surprising how easy it was to talk to David. We ended up abandoning our book search and found a cozy corner in the library's cafe. Hours seemed to fly by as cups of coffee turned cold and our conversation delved deeper. "I've always loved this library," David confessed, looking around with a nostalgic smile. "I used to come here with my mom. She'd read to me for hours." "Sounds lovely," I said, thinking about my own childhood memories. "It was," David replied with a distant look in his eyes. "But things change." There was an unspoken depth to that statement, hinting at stories yet untold. It made me even more curious about him. We left the library with a promise to meet again. From that day on, David and I were inseparable. Each date felt like an exploration, not just of the places we went to, but of each other's worlds. The bond we shared grew stronger, leading us to a beautiful wedding day where I felt like everything was falling into place. Yet, amidst all the joy, one figure stood out, casting a long shadow on our happiness. David's mother, Mrs. Marion Hughes. Her sharp gaze always seemed to linger on me a little too long, her smiles never quite reaching her eyes. I hoped that with time, she'd see how much David and I loved each other and accept our union. But that was a hope soon to be tested. The excitement of expecting a baby was overshadowed by the constant nausea and fatigue I felt. Every morning was a battle, and by evening I was utterly exhausted. David watched with concern, always by my side, supporting me in every way he could. One evening, after a particularly rough day, David approached the subject. "Amelia, maybe we should think about moving closer to family for a while, just until the baby comes." I hesitated. Moving back to David's family home meant being closer to Marion. "Do you think that's a good idea?" I asked, uncertainty in my voice. He took my hand gently. "It's just a thought. Mom did raise 3 kids. She might help with the baby stuff and, more importantly, support you when I'm at work." I pondered over it. "I'm just worried about how things are with your mom," I admitted. David sighed. "I know Mom can be a bit difficult, but she's still family. Maybe with the baby on the way, things might change. Give her a chance?" With a deep breath, I agreed. "All right, but if things get tough, we need to have a backup plan." The move happened quicker than I anticipated. David's childhood home was a large, old-fashioned house with creaking floorboards and a sense of history. The first day we arrived, Marion greeted us at the door, a broad smile on her face. "Welcome home, David," she said, hugging her son tightly. Then, turning to me, her tone softened. "And you too, Amelia. I hope your stay here is comfortable." For the first few days, Marion was the image of a doting mother-in-law. She made my favorite meals, helped me set up the nursery, and shared stories of David's childhood. It was almost as if the icy tension from before had melted away. One evening, while David and I were in the living room, Marion joined us with a tray of hot cocoa. Handing me a cup, she said, "You know, Amelia, pregnancy suits you. You look radiant." I smiled. "Thanks, Marion, and thank you for everything you've been doing. It's been a great help." She nodded. "It's the least I can do. Family takes care of each other." The words sounded reassuring, but a faint trace of something in her eyes made me wonder. It seemed like a perfect setup, a haven I hadn't expected. But as the days turned to weeks, subtle changes began to emerge. The sweet facade Marion put up began to show cracks, especially when David wasn't around. I tried to brush off the unease, hoping that my pregnancy hormones were just making me overly sensitive. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Marion's kindness than met the eye. The days in the old house started to feel longer. With David often away at work, it was mostly just Marion and me. It didn't take long for her kind behavior to shift when we were alone. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen, making a sandwich. Marion walked in, looked at what I was preparing and said, "You know, David always liked his sandwiches with more mayo, but I guess he's settled for less now." Taken aback, I replied, "I didn't know that. He never told me." She shrugged. "There's a lot you don't know about my son." Days like this became more common. It was always a comment here, a remark there. Each time, she made sure David wasn't around to hear. One day, I was resting in the living room, going through some baby names. Marion came and sat next to me. "You know, Amelia," she began, "if only David had chosen someone more, well, someone better suited to our family." I looked up, surprised. "What do you mean, Marion?" She leaned in closer. "Let's be honest. You've struggled so much with this pregnancy. It makes me wonder if you'll be able to handle what comes next." I felt a sting in my eyes, holding back tears. "I'm doing my best," I whispered. Marion sighed. "For David's sake, I hope your best is good enough." Every interaction became a challenge. I tried to avoid being alone with her, but she always found a way. The house felt oppressive, and I started to dread each day. The only solace was David's comforting presence when he came home. But even with him, I hesitated to speak up, fearing it might cause a rift between mother and son. Things got even more strained when David informed us of a business trip he had to take. "It's just for a few days," he assured me, pulling me into a hug. "Mom will be here with you. Everything will be all right." The night before his trip, I overheard David talking to Marion in the hallway. "Please, Mother," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Promise me you'll take care of Amelia." Marion's voice was sugary sweet as she replied, "Of course, my dear. Don't you worry. I'll look after her." I went to bed that night with a heavy heart, sensing that the storm was far from over. With David gone, the house's atmosphere grew thicker than ever. Every room I walked into felt like stepping onto a battlefield with Marion. But as the days went by, I realized that I couldn't just keep dodging her verbal attacks. I needed to defend myself, and maybe even counterattack. The day after David left, I sat in our shared living room, browsing through online forums for advice on dealing with difficult family members. The consensus was clear. Evidence was crucial. That's when the idea of the voice recorder struck me. If I could capture Marion's words, I could finally show David her true nature. The very next day, I made a trip to a local electronics store. As I was browsing through the different recorders available, a friendly store assistant approached. "Looking for something specific?" he asked. "Something that can record voice discreetly," I answered. He nodded, showing me a small device. "This one's quite popular. Easy to conceal and clear audio quality." I bought it immediately, feeling like I'd acquired a shield against Marion. Upon returning home, I found Marion in the living room. She was going through a photo album, probably reminiscing about the past. "Ah, Amelia," she said without looking up. "Come, see these photos of David when he was young. So innocent and unburdened. Before all this." I sat down, my new recorder discreetly activated in my pocket. "He always speaks fondly of his childhood," I remarked, trying to keep the conversation neutral. She gave a half smile. "Well, he had a mother who cared for him, who knew how to bring up a child properly. Unlike some." I took a deep breath, attempting to stay calm. "I'm sure we all do our best for our loved ones, Marion." She scoffed. "Doing one's best and knowing what's best are two different things. I just hope my grandchild doesn't suffer due to your inexperience." I nodded, biting back a retort. "Thank you for the advice, Marion." Little did she know that every snide remark was being captured. The days dragged on, and I gathered more evidence. Simultaneously, I started searching for an escape plan, a place of my own where I could breathe. After a thorough search, I stumbled upon a quaint apartment nearby. It felt right, a sanctuary from Marion's constant onslaught. One evening, as I went over my recordings and thought about the apartment, I felt a surge of hope. This was more than just about standing up to Marion. It was about securing a peaceful future for my child and me. It was about ensuring David knew the truth. With renewed energy, I prepared for the days ahead, knowing they wouldn't be easy, but believing they'd be worth it. A few days had passed since David's departure. Despite my attempts to keep a distance, Marion seemed to be pushing harder, testing my limits. One particular evening, after dinner, she decided to bring up the topic of baby names. I was in the living room, looking through a baby name book David had bought for us. Naming a child is a significant task, she began, settling herself on the sofa opposite me. It should be done with care. I looked up, nodding. David and I have a list. We're considering a few options. Marion tilted her head, her eyes sharp. Well, let's hear them. Taking a deep breath, I began. We're thinking of Lily if it's a girl or Ethan if it's a boy. She rolled her eyes. Lily? Sounds like a name for a pet. And Ethan? So common. I felt my cheeks heat up. They're just options. We haven't decided. Marion leaned in, her voice cold. You know, in our family, we have traditions. David was named after his grandfather. Maybe you should respect that instead of choosing random names from a book. Stung by her words, I replied, David and I will name our child together. It's our decision. She stood up abruptly, knocking the book from my hands. You're so ungrateful. I've tried to help, to guide you, but you're just bent on ruining my son's life and that of my grandchild. I was taken aback. Marion, I never asked for your help. All I wanted was some peace. With a mocking laugh, she retorted, Peace? You think you deserve peace after everything you've done? You've turned my son against me. That was the last straw. I haven't done anything. It's you who can't let go and let him live his life. Marion's face turned a deep shade of red. You ungrateful wretch, she yelled, pointing towards the door. Leave! I don't even want that child to be born. Shaken, I tried to hold back tears. This is my home too. But Marion was relentless. She reached into my bag, grabbing my keys, and tossed them out the door. There, now go. Breathing hard, with my emotions in a whirl, I took a moment to gather myself. I remembered the apartment I had rented, my sanctuary. Picking up my bag, I looked Marion in the eye. You might regret this. Without waiting for a reply, I stepped out, closing the door behind me. It was clear. The battle lines had been drawn. The next few days in the apartment were a mix of peace and apprehension. I missed David terribly and worried about how he would react to everything once he returned. The day of David's return finally arrived. My phone buzzed with a message from him. Just landed. Coming home soon. Can't wait to see you. I replied, I'm at the new apartment. Call me when you get to the house. 2 hours later, David called. His voice was a mix of confusion and concern. Amelia, why are you in an apartment? Where's all your stuff? Why aren't you home? I took a deep breath. David, there's a lot you need to know. After explaining everything, from the voice recordings to the final confrontation with Marion, there was silence on the other end. Then, I'll be there in 10 minutes. When David arrived, I played him the recordings. His face turned from shock to anger with every word Marion spewed. When it ended, he looked devastated. I can't believe she said all those things to you. I'm so sorry, Amelia. Taking his hand, I said, David, it's not your fault. I just couldn't stay there anymore. David's eyes were fierce. We're confronting her together. We drove back to the house, and as we entered, Marion was sitting in the living room, feigning surprise. David, welcome back. Where's Amelia? David's voice was ice cold. She's right here, and we've heard everything. Marion looked between us, trying to gauge the situation. I don't know what you're talking about. Without saying a word, David played one of the most damning recordings. Marion's face paled. When it ended, David's voice trembled with anger. How could you, Mother? She's carrying our child, your grandchild. Marion's eyes darted around, searching for an excuse. David, you don't understand. I was trying to protect you. David cut her off. Protect me? By tormenting Amelia? That's not protection. That's cruelty. Marion started crying. I just wanted the best for you. David shook his head. Your version of the best isn't what I want. Amelia and our baby are my family now. You need to respect that. Marion sobbed harder, trying to reach out to David, but he stepped back. I need some time, Mother. Away from all this. Taking my hand, David led me out of the house, and we drove back to the apartment. The rift between mother and son was evident. But in that moment, our bond grew stronger, united against the deceit we had faced. The new apartment was a stark contrast to the opulence of the house we had left. It was cozy, with sunlight streaming in through large windows. There was something liberating about this modest space. It felt like the fresh start we desperately needed, a place where David and I could rebuild our life and prepare for the arrival of our baby without any dark clouds hanging over us. David and I spent the first few days setting things up. We transformed the second bedroom into a nursery, picking out neutral tones for the walls and assembling furniture piece by piece. As we painted the baby's room one afternoon, David said, "You know, all things considered, this place feels more like home than the big house ever did." I smiled, dipping my brush into the paint. It does, doesn't it? It's smaller but feels warmer. While putting up a shelf, David found a photo from our wedding day, tucked inside a book. "Look at us," he remarked, passing me the photograph. Our smiles radiated pure joy, blissfully unaware of the storms ahead. "We've come a long way since then," I mused, placing the photo on the freshly painted shelf. "But we've also grown stronger together." David wrapped an arm around me. "I still feel guilty, Amelia. I thought going back to that house, to my mother, would be the solution. How wrong I was." I looked up at him. "It's not your fault, David. We made that decision together, and now we're starting anew, together." A few days later, an unexpected package arrived. No return address, but we recognized the handwriting. Inside was a meticulously knit baby blanket, soft to the touch, accompanied by a note. Reading it aloud, David's voice was filled with mixed emotions. "I hope this can mend our relationship. Marion." We exchanged glances, both pondering the same question. Could things ever go back to the way they were? After a deep sigh, I said, "It's a beautiful blanket, and I appreciate the effort, but—" David nodded in understanding. "I know. We need to protect our peace, our family. The past has shown us that." We were unified in our decision. Our focus was the life we were creating, the family we were building, and the love that remained unshakable. The baby's imminent arrival was our beacon of hope, and every corner of the apartment was a testament to that. We had carved out a sanctuary, distancing ourselves from past hurts and looking forward to a future filled with love and trust. Our new apartment became a symphony of baby cries and joyous laughter. Sophie, with her tufts of brown hair and curious hazel eyes reminiscent of David, was our pride and joy. The tough times we'd weathered seemed distant, like a storm that had passed, leaving only clear skies behind. David and I often found ourselves marveling at the little life we'd created. Late one night, as we were both up attending to a fussy Sophie, he looked at me with admiration. "You're incredible, you know. Getting through everything with Marion, and now being such an amazing mom." I smiled, gently rocking Sophie. "We did it together, and look at what we have now." I gestured to our daughter, who was slowly drifting back to sleep. One Sunday afternoon, as Sophie played on her mat, David proposed a little outing. "How about a trip to the library tomorrow? It's where our story began. I think it's time Sophie knows that place." I nodded in agreement. "Sounds perfect. We can make it a family tradition." The next day, the library greeted us with its familiar silence. We showed Sophie the very spot where we had met. David, holding her little hand, whispered, "This is where I met your mom, where our family's story began." In that moment, standing in the midst of aisles filled with countless stories, we felt grateful for our own. We had faced challenges, yes, but they had shaped our journey, guiding us to this present moment. The library had been the start of our story, and now it played a part in Sophie's. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, life continued its rhythm. We shared tales of bravery and love with Sophie, always emphasizing the importance of standing up for oneself and one's family. Marion, although a part of our past, barely featured in our conversations. One evening, while putting Sophie to bed, I realized the true weight of the decisions we had made. By choosing our family's happiness and well-being over external pressures, we had set a foundation for Sophie to grow up, knowing the value of love, trust, and resilience. With Sophie asleep, I walked out to the living room where David was waiting. We sat, hands entwined, looking at the city lights. The world outside held challenges and uncertainties, but in our little apartment, there was only warmth, love, and the promise of many tomorrows.